In 399 BC, one of the founding fathers of the Western philosophical tradition, Socrates, stood trial in Athens. 3 citizens brought forward charges against him. Socrates was accused of corrupting the minds of the youth and also denying the existence of the gods. What we know about his trial comes from what he allegedly spoke in his own defense. It's said that one of his students, Plato, wrote down his speech after the fact. And from this text, we gather that Socrates was going around town and talking to people who were claiming to have some kind of authority or wisdom. He would question them in his own method, only to end up finding out that their knowledge could not be substantiated in a methodical or logical fashion. He would then proceed to dismiss them, claiming that he was wiser than they were. His knowledge, he said, his wisdom resided in his knowledge that he knew nothing. So even with knowing nothing, he was still wiser than people who mistakenly believed to know something. Not knowing that they did not know, their ignorance, Socrates argued, is what made them unwise, and he the wiser. You can see why Socrates was perceived to be corrupting the minds of the youth. He appears to have been decimating traditional beliefs, which were thought to be so sacred that to question them would be considered tantamount to heresy or sacrilege. But really what Socrates was doing was opening the minds of his students to alternative ways of seeing, to a deeper, more uncomfortable truth beneath the veneer of false beliefs, which had become so deeply entrenched through tradition and repetition that they had now become as real to the people of Athens as this very room and as our very presence. The Socratic method, which requires the substantiation of what we think we know to be true, predates the discovery of the scientific method by approximately 2,000 years. His trial and subsequent sentencing to death by poisoning, which is the ultimate means to silence him, predates concepts of academic and intellectual freedom and contemporary debates in universities about trigger warnings by even more than 2,000 years. The concept of academic freedom emerged in the early modern scholastic institutions when clerical influences began to yield to scientific discoveries which were contradicting scripture. So foremost of these would be Darwin's theory of evolution, which, based on evidence, was contradicting the doctrine of creationism and the biblical age of the earth. So following the Enlightenment and well into the formative years of the 20th century, there was a concentrated effort to ensure that the scholar would be allowed to speak. Universities sought to foster a culture in which students deferred to the authority of the scholar because they saw the value in the advancement of knowledge in an evidence-based way. However, with the advent of corporate interests and the corporatization of the university and the tertiary education system, universities began to operate under a business funding model. And in this way, in this new economy, students came to wield power as a paying customer. And we begin to encourage students to evaluate course content based on their feelings. We ask them whether they enjoyed their classes, whether they would recommend the course to another student. We encourage them to reflect on their overall experience with words like, were you very satisfied, satisfied, neutral, dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied? In the retail industry, the customer is not just always right, but from a managerial perspective, a complaint or accusation against the service-providing employee, which is what the scholar now is, functions virtually identically to actual guilt. So in the age of trigger warning, it doesn't really matter whether course content can actually traumatize a person or not. What matters is that management now has to deal with a student claiming to be or feeling traumatized in connection to a particular course. So a scholar accused of corrupting the minds of the young might as well be corrupting the minds of the young. So the process which follows complaints or accusations of this kind tend to lead to either the modification of the course or its complete removal by management, either directly or insidiously, or through the professor's own self-censorship. We have developed a need to ensure that the scholar does not speak in a way which may be deemed injurious or alarming or distressing to the prejudices and preconceptions of her students, and sometimes even their parents. And I stress here that I'm talking about prejudices and preconceptions. I'm not giving the scholar free rein to offend or to be insensitive, but really it's about those instances in history where the scholar is vindicated and the society is indicted. But because what she has to say makes us feel vulnerable, because it takes us to that place of emotional vulnerability, we treat the cause of our emotions synonymously with the scholar, and we treat that as a threat, and the university treats the situation also synonymously with the scholar and treats it as a liability. So for this reason, the university is no longer the best place where we can challenge our ideas and conceptions of the world, because it can no longer offer us a public arena for challenging yet appropriate discourse in the way it had been able to over in the past decades. So for most of us, the unrelenting pursuit of truth is nowhere nearly as valuable as the comfort that we draw from living in a world where our cosmology is small enough to be tangible, predictable, and comfortable. We don't want to live without the certitude of a ground to ground us. We do not want to awaken to what Socrates realized, and that is, essentially, we know nothing. But it is precisely in that state of not knowing that we have the opportunity to solve a difficult problem, to resolve a deeply seated complex, to produce a kinder, gentler, more just world. It is precisely in that state of mind that acknowledges our profound ignorance, as well as our vast awareness, that we can begin to see new things in old, long-standing structures. So what I really wanted to do at the very onset of my academic career was to study gender and sexuality in the Arab world. More specifically, I wanted to know whether there was an existent same-sex desire amongst women. I wanted to know how far back did it go, what forms did it take, what were the cultural understandings of it, and what remaining evidence was there. It was a very ambitious project, and there I was studying classical Arabic literature, predominantly from the 9th and 10th centuries, as well as popular Egyptian film and modern Arabic fiction, in conjunction with theories of gender and sexuality that were produced in the Western Academy of the 20th century. Female Homosexuality in the Middle East, which is also the title of my doctoral dissertation, was accepted for publication by a prestigious academic publisher even prior to the award of the degree. So shortly afterwards, I entered the workforce, and it was really my first opportunity to teach some of my research, and I was continuing my research trajectory, which was now moving into the study of homosexuality in relation to Islam and Muslims, as opposed to my previous focus, which was on the popular cultures of the Arab world, both in the past and the present. And I should footnote here that the study of Islam does not conflict for me with my cultural heritage. So that even though I was raised in a very secular, albeit culturally Christian household, Islam for many of us Palestinians and Arabs more broadly is a natural extension of our cultural identity. It connects us to language, history, and it gives us a sense of civilizational continuity. It doesn't have the negative connotations, and it's not the caricature that it appears to be in popular and political Western discourse of contemporary times. So we approach it respectfully and dutifully. So there I was at 27 years of age, getting the chance to teach my research for the very first time. And I didn't think that there was anything terribly controversial about giving an account of how homophobia began to emerge in the Arabo-Muslim world. There was a period of time, particularly centered around the 9th century, when gender and sexual diversity enjoyed a kind of a heyday, a very comfortable place in public and discursive space. So I didn't think that there was anything particularly controversial about also contradicting some of the basic theoretical theories and assumptions and conclusions that were emerging out of gender and sexuality theory in the academy. And I didn't think that I was doing anything particularly heroic or special by demonstrating that women loved each other sexually and romantically in the Arab world of the Middle Ages, and that they developed identities around these sexual practices. So for example, in Morocco of the 13th century, they would use the code word dharifa. So this is the word dharifa, it means witty or funny, and it operated as a code word with which same-sex attracted women would be able to identify each other. And in the presence of a code word, this of course necessarily implies that there is a subculture here as well. There were also stories of epic, lifelong love between women. And in one instance, a male poet uses one such couple as a proverbial example of fidelity and devotion. There's nothing really controversial, to my mind, about establishing the fact that these women had a literature to describe them and their erotic adventures, of which we have some surviving remnants. In another extraordinary example from the 9th century, there was this really famous singer named Badal. And Badal lived in Baghdad, and she was entertaining in the court of Al-Khalifa al-Ma'mun. A Khalifa is a kind of an emperor or king. And she decided for some strange reason, I should also say that she never married and she rejected so many offers of marriage. And she decided that day she was, singing for the Khalif, to sing that there's nothing more delectable than having sex with another woman. And he interrupts her and he respectfully disagrees, but then he asks her to continue her song. So that's a really, truly remarkable exchange between this woman who has rejected marriage, an institution we would have thought would have been compulsory, and who decided to sing about her sexual preference in the presence of basically one of the most powerful leaders in one of the world's most advanced civilizations on the planet at the time. It's a very interesting exchange. So I really don't think that what I have to teach is cause for concern, and I am really at a loss at how easily it can be distorted. Now, let me give you another example. This one feels controversial. In Al-Andalus, which is the name that we give to Islamic Spain, there was a scholar named Ibn Hazm. And Ibn Hazm deployed a particular methodology of interpreting the Quran, in which he saw that same-sex sexual behavior was not punishable. So he doesn't go so far as to say same-sex behavior is permitted Quranically. He just says that you can't rightly warrant punishment if you are looking at the Quranic verses themselves. So again, there is really nothing controversial here. What there is a 12th century scholar who says that there are no verses in the Quran that punish homosexuality. And this scholar also mentions that some communities of his time outrightly permitted same-sex sexual behavior. So, while others forbade it and punishment, and he didn't believe that that punishment was warranted. So what's interesting is that here is from Ibn Hazm and from various other sources across the vast geographies and expanses that we call the Islamic world, here's another uncomfortable truth. The forbiddance of homosexuality among Muslims has never been universal. I'm not even saying that homosexuality is permitted in something we can objectively say is Islam or not. I'm not making that kind of fundamental claim about Scripture. All I'm demonstrating is that, theologically, in the Scripture itself, in the primary source of this particular faith, and without the privileging of specific interpretative traditions over others, there's much greater room for interpretation that may be adamantly believed by the majority, and much greater possibility for inclusiveness than there is for condemnation. But when you are examining as deeply entrenched as it is potentially insubstantial, you run the risk of being perceived as a threat, and you must be silenced. And because I was helping establish new facts, I had to be punished, and my teaching was silenced. And yet, even in the absence of a scholastic institution to facilitate my research, and for me to disseminate my research through teaching, I still research, and I still teach what I learn. My search for truth was personal, it was environmental, it was social, it was cultural, and eventually, and against my will, it also became political. I'm here today fully aware that I'm speaking to an audience of predominantly university students and their faculty, and I want to appeal to you with this very basic message. Let the scholar speak, even if it scares you, even if it threatens a sense of core identity. History has not been kind to civilizations that fall asleep at the wheel, that burn books, that punish thinkers, that silence critics. These are the civilizations and empires that fall. The ones that flourish and rise to unprecedented heights of human renaissance are the ones that open themselves up to vulnerability, that acknowledge the uncertainty that underlies all knowledge, that defer to the authority of a scholar, that leave room for doubt, and that revere differences of opinion. And such was the case of 9th century Baghdad, where scholars accurately measured the circumference of the earth based on the work of another great civilization, the Greeks before them. They made advances in medicine, in astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and geology, advances to which the contemporary world owes its current enlightenment. So please, let the scholar speak, not just when it suits you, but even and especially when it scares you. Thank you.